Jonathan, of course, you've got half of Americans probably cheering this decision and, another large group of people who think that these companies have gone too far. You seem to think it's not quite enough what Twitter and Facebook have done. Where are you on this?
Well, thank you for having me, Emily. Look, I think it's fair to say that our country is indeed polarized and divided. The election was a remarkable moment. We had more turnout than ever, and it was fairly split down the middle. But let's be clear on what we're talking about here. What we saw since before and then after the election was a rising level of violent rhetoric and incitement on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. That's why the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which successfully moved Facebook to action this summer to finally deal with hate on their platform, called for Donald Trump to be banned permanently from Facebook and Twitter. And Facebook, they have now banned him indefinitely, as was noted in the previous segment. And Twitter, after our call, indeed banned him permanently as well. The reason we're asking for this and why it is so important is because we literally saw the president, or with his fingers or his thumbs, if you will, encouraging violence as people were assaulting police officers on the steps of our Capitol. And who were these people? These were not protesters. These were militants. These were militants not staging not like as part of a riot. It was a planned attack. It was arguably the darkest day of our democracy. So indeed, it is critical to realize, how did that terror attack happen? It was planned. It was envisioned, and it was encouraged on social media. So yes, I think it's safe to say they are in some ways accessories to this awful act. And it's not an unreasonable expectation that this needs to change now. So I really would salute Amazon for the step they did with Parler. Pushing Parler off of their hosting services was a principled decision, because they have to ask themselves, they have to be able to look their employees in the eye, their board in the eye. And Jeff Bezos has to say, do we want to be an accessory to an insurgency? Because what we're talking about, Emily, is nothing less than a violent insurgency that threatens our democracy.
And to be clear, these are private companies. They have the right to decide who they do business with. We don't believe there's any legal issue, but there certainly is an issue about the principle of free speech. And there are plenty of folks out there, Jonathan, who disagree with you, including Republican lawmakers. Senator Marsha Blackburn tweeted to Jack Dorsey saying, "Why does the leader of Iran get to keep his Twitter account and the president of the United States does not? Twitter is more like the Chinese Communist Party than an American company." Senator Lindsey Graham, "I'm more determined than ever to strip Section 230 protections from big tech that let them be immune to lawsuits. Your decision to permanently ban Trump is a serious mistake." What about the concern that this could fire up the president's base so much that we could see potentially even more violence or a more extreme reaction because of the disagreement?
Look, I think that the militants storming the Capitol did not represent the entire Republican Party or even a majority of the Republican Party. These were terrorists, pure and simple. But let's keep in mind that incitement to violence is not protected speech. Freedom of speech isn't the freedom to slander. Freedom of expression isn't the freedom to incite violence. That's not protected by the First Amendment. Now, Senator Graham and Senator Blackburn and others have reasonable concerns. We should ask ourselves, do we want to live in a society where Mark Zuckerberg, apparently according to the last segment, or Jack Dorsey decide what's in the public discourse or not? That's a very reasonable question. We need to have a debate about 230. But what we're talking about here, if you look at Parler, as recently as yesterday, there were calls for a violent insurgency in this country. It is not censorship for a company to say, we don't want to be doing business with others who are literally, who would encourage and sort of glorify, again, the killing of 5 people, the violence and mayhem that ensued. I just don't think in any reasonable scenario, one thinks that's consistent with any democratic process. So I think we have to look each other in the eye and say to ourselves, how do we want to be remembered in terms of history? Do we want to be on the right side of history or not? Parler, Gab, Amino, Minds, there are all these sites that are part of this ecosystem of hate, this sort of this scenario of violence. And again, I think By the way, whether it's this, not just the platforms themselves, the hosting companies, the web security companies, the payment providers, they all need to say, do we really want to do business with companies that are agents of chaos?
Well, and it's not just cutting off the president himself and a handful of other accounts. I mean, the followers of the president and some folks who have been spreading hate are continuing to do that on Facebook and Twitter, let's be clear. You have been tracking threats of violence, and indeed the FBI has now confirmed they're preparing for potential armed riots in the state capitals of all 50 states as of January 16th. What exactly are you seeing in terms of these threats?
Emily, it's not an understatement to say that this is terrifying. At the ADL, our Center on Extremists have been tracking these movements and these individuals in the different groups. And we've seen indeed a lot of chatter around January 17th when there's a Boogaloo rally planned in DC. The Boogaloo movement wants to incite a violent civil war in the US. On January the 20th, people are saying we should take up arms. And we've seen in recent days, our analysts are looking at several different threads where there seems to be a desire to move outside of DC, which they know is going to be a hard target, to softer targets in the states. So this is real. This is not this conversation about free speech. It's a nice luxury in a constitutional law class, but this is real life. And the threat of violence is real. And just keep in mind, we saw this over the last sort of 6+ months. We had the occupation of the State House in Lansing, Michigan, where armed militias literally invaded the building. We had a similar effort to do the same thing in the capital of Idaho. We had a plot to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan. We had a plot to kidnap the governor of Virginia. These groups are not Republicans or Democrats. These groups are terrorists. These are armed cells. They are using this technology to organize, just like ISIS in the Middle East. And we need to recognize the threat that it poses. Our analysts are working with the FBI. We're tracking and sharing the intelligence. I'm confident the authorities now take this seriously. And we're going to need that, Emily, because we've got some dark days ahead. And thinking that we can just, that this will work itself out is wrong. And thinking that this is a free speech debate right now is wrong. This is a threat, a physical, violent threat to our democracy, and we've got to treat it with the attention and the resources that demands.